if we're mindlessly eating and we can pay attention, we can notice, oh, I'm not actually hungry. I'm just eating out of boredom or because that snack happens to be there. It's like the seafood, I see food and I eat it type of thing. So we've got to be able to wake up to that and see that it's happening. That's the first step.
Can you share one highly effective yet often overlooked technique for breaking a stubborn habit that listeners and viewers can start implementing today?
It's a good question. Okay, how about this one? Smoking. Big, hardest habit to break in addiction.
Yeah.
And here's the technique that I've used. And we've gotten, in one study, we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment when we did a randomized controlled trial using this.
5 times?
5 times.
The quit rate. Wow.
You ready?
Yeah.
Patient walks into my office. They want to quit smoking. I say, go ahead and smoke. And they look at me like I'm crazy because my doc just told me to smoke. But I give them one little piece on top of that. And I say, pay attention when you smoke. So they go home and they come back and they're like, how did I not see this before? Because when they pay attention when they smoke a cigarette, it tastes like crap.
Interesting. So awareness, bringing awareness to the habit.
Yep. It is a superpower. And the awareness really taps into the strength of our brain to help us be able to leverage this reinforcement learning aspect of our brain that is really, really strong, much stronger than willpower.
Wow. Very interesting. It's I feel like this is a recurring theme because I was perusing your new book, The Hunger Habit, which is phenomenal, by the way, and it tackles a habit that I think is actually increasing in incidence today, right? Like our habit for consuming and ultimately over-consuming ultra-processed, highly refined, ultimately fattening foods, right?
Yeah.
Smoking, I feel, at least living in Los Angeles, it seems to be on the decline somewhat. But yet you look at population statistics, people are getting fatter, belly fat is increasing across the board. So applied to why we eat when we're not hungry, right? So how does that work? Is it as simple as bringing awareness to our food choices, or what is it laid out for us?
Yeah, well, let's start with ultra-processed food if you want to go there first. And then we can talk about these coping mechanisms that we develop with food. Ultra-processed food ultimately is there to, have a long shelf life and get us addicted to eating it. My favorite peer-reviewed journal, the Onion, they had a headline that says Dorito celebrates its 1 millionth ingredient, right? Because they are dialing in that bliss point, and that electric orange. It's not a coincidence that Cheetos and Doritos both have the same electric orange, So it's there to get us hooked. And, to get into our bloodstream really quickly and to get us to jack our dopamine and get us to want more. So that's the starting point. We're fighting against this food industry that's been engineering food for a long time. Do you remember the Lay's slogan, "Bet you can't eat just one"?
Vaguely, yeah.
Yeah. Do you know when that first came out?
No.
A little bit of trivia. 1963. So they were already starting to work with this. Ironically, that's the same year that Weight Watchers formed.
Whoa. Interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, it really is the proliferation of these highly refined, hyper palatable, ultra processed foods that have, and like I'm sure you've looked at like obesity statistics and the like. Like, is that when it really started to take off from a public health standpoint? The last graph, I'm picturing this one graph that I think started in 1985 and went to 2015. So over 4 decades. And so when they started looking in the 80s, they were starting to see, this is a problem. I don't know if there are great data. I'm sure there are some data from the 60s and 70s, but it was really in the 80s when people started to pay attention to this. And now it's described as an epidemic, a clinical obesity epidemic. And I want to say clinical obesity because I think there's a lot of confusion around things like people who are healthy but fat. And so there's all this fat shaming and concern in society around like, hey, somebody can be fat from a BMI standpoint, but not unhealthy. So what we're talking about here is clinical obesity, like where it's really affecting people's health. But would you say it's the minority, or is it is somebody who's highly overweight hits that threshold in terms of their BMI for being overweight, is it likely that they're also going to be healthy, or is it more likely to be the case that they're going to be unhealthy on the inside as well?
Let's just put it that there's a huge amount of clinical obesity out there, and people are still trying to dial through the data because a lot of this is based on BMI, and it's not accurate enough to determine the difference between healthy obesity and clinical obesity.
Right.
But what we see from the trends is that clinical obesity is going up, and we're also seeing things like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, obstructive sleep apnea, all these ramifications, all these secondary effects that are secondary to clinical obesity. Those are also going up.
So would you say it's fair to say that the BMI is a good sort of screening tool, but it's not a diagnostic tool? Like
Absolutely.
you would never diagnose somebody with obesity based on their BMI alone.
Yeah, and some people are arguing that we need better measures than BMI. It's just it's just so easy that people use it. You measure your height and your weight and you're done. So, it lacks specificity, but it certainly tries to make up for that in simplicity and ease of implementation.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense. On this podcast, we've talked a ton about what it is that people are eating. We've talked about when to eat and how that's a variable that might prove empowering with the continual evolution of circadian biology research and all that. But you argue that how we eat is actually the most important variable. What do you mean by that?
Well, our bodies are really wise. And so we can start to dial into some of these evolutionary mechanisms like you talked about, time-restricted eating, things like that can probably be pretty helpful for us. And I think there's good emerging data suggesting that a lot of these things are helpful. But what we're looking at here is we're reading books, we're listening to podcasts, we're watching YouTube videos, we're doing all these things, and we're not listening to the most important thing and the wisest thing, which is this body. And what I mean by that is that we're just totally divorced from our bodies. We don't know when we're actually hungry. Here's an example. So I was in my clinic, I was working with a group of I think this was all women who had binge eating disorder, right? So they all these criteria for binge eating disorder, but basically I was working with them and I felt like I was missing something. And it took me we were doing these weekly sessions. It took me several weeks and I realized, oh, wait a minute. They don't actually know the difference between homeostatic hunger, like physiologic hunger, and hedonic hunger, which is like eat because you feel like it. And they're like, oh yeah, I crave, I eat. And I say, well, how do you know when you're hungry? And they looked at me like it was the strangest question in the world. Because like, I don't know. Because they just weren't used to paying attention to their body signals. And that's a huge issue here. So the paying attention to that aspect of our experience, our body's going to tell us everything that we need to know in terms of what to eat, how much to eat, when to stop, et cetera, et cetera. But we are just so divorced from it, we don't know how to do that. So we have to kind of recalibrate that awareness.
What has triggered that divorce?
That's a great question. I can give you some baseless speculation, some BS. I don't really know, but I think a lot of it is, if you look at our evolutionary mechanisms, we're set up so that when there's something pleasant, we move toward it. When there's something unpleasant, we try to push it away. So our bodies often don't feel great. Our body image often isn't great thanks to a lot of societal conditioning. And so somebody might look in the mirror and they're like, ooh, I don't look great, unpleasant. So they're just going to divorce themselves from their body. Often people get distracted. They live in their heads. So there are probably a number of mechanisms that contribute to that. But I would guess a lot of them share that common mechanism of, oh, something's unpleasant, whether it's an emotion, a physical sensation, or just, a thought, and they're going to push that away. And one way to do that is to kind of divorce themselves from their body. This isn't a completely modern phenomenon. There's a great short story by James Joyce called A Painful Case. And I think the first liner in the first paragraph, he says, Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body. So we're seeing this back, and he wrote that, I think, in 1914. So we're seeing that, 100 years ago, people were still divorced from their bodies, even though we didn't have all these things that could distract us, like social media and our phones and things like that.
Super interesting. So we're essentially disconnected.
Yeah.
Man. So what are the steps then required to bring us back into our bodies?
Yes. Well, that's a great question. And I think, so what we found in the research that I've done over the last 20 years or so is it seems to be a 3-step process. And this is interesting because we kind of stumbled upon this when we were doing our smoking cessation studies, and we were finding, 5 times the quit rates, gold standard treatment, pretty good. We started making a digital therapeutic for smoking, and we were having people pilot test it. And they came back to me and said, hey, I'm changing my eating habits. And I looked at them. I was like, okay, most people gain 15 pounds when they quit smoking because nicotine's a stimulant and all this. And they said, no, we're actually cutting down on our snacking. And I looked at them and I was like, can you say that again? Did I get that right? And they're like, no, I'm actually cutting down on my snacking. I realized that there's this common mechanism that underlies probably all habits. And it's pretty simple. And that's the first step in kind of learning how to step out of it. And over the last 20 years, we've actually seen this very clear stepwise process. We've even done studies with focus groups to articulate it a little bit more. But the first step is just being able to map out the habit loop, and really 3 elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. So for example, with eating, when we're not hungry, let's say, let's start with what it's supposed to do. So imagine our ancient ancestors out on the savannah or in the woods foraging for food. They find some food. There's the trigger or the cue, right? And then they eat the food. There's the behavior. And then their stomach sends this dopamine signal to their brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. So this learning mechanism is set up, we call it context-dependent memory formation. So you're learning something in a context. You learn where the food is. In modern day, that's called positive reinforcement, right? Eric Kendall got the Nobel Prize back in 2000 showing this is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. So very well-known mechanism.
Wow.
And the negative reinforcement side of it is very similar. Think of, you see that you're out foraging, you see the saber-toothed tiger, you run away, there's the behavior, and then you're not eaten, there's the reward. Then you learn, okay, there's a dangerous part of the savannah. So that negative reinforcement is especially true in modern day because that mechanism is still in place. And we learn to use it when we're sad, when we're lonely, when we're angry, when we're bored, all these emotions that are unpleasant. And if we happen to eat some food that distracts us or tastes good or feels pleasant, that's going to be better than that emotion. And we can learn to distract ourselves from the emotion by eating. So here's the stress eating, comfort food, all of these things are related to this negative reinforcement mechanism. None of that has to do with actual physiologic hunger.
Right. And we have a bias for negative emotions, right? Because they were the emotions that were probably more required our attention in a more direct and immediate way. Because obviously, if there's a negative emotion for probably the vast majority of our time on Earth, on this planet, was elicited by some kind of physical threat, the potential of physical threat, famine, something like really bad.
Yeah.
And now our emotions are negatively stimulated by news media, social media, that work email that we got, the text message that remains unanswered. And so, but we have a bias, right? We have like this negativity bias.
Yeah. And let's apply this to food. This is interesting. Well, I think it's interesting. If you look at food, if you eat some food, right? And let's say you eat some chocolate and you can start tasting it and you're like, oh, that's a new type of dark chocolate. You know how chocolates have all their different nuances to them. And you're like, oh, that's kind of smoky. There's this whatever. So you can sit there and you can savor it and you can pay attention, and it takes a while to register how good it is. So notice how slow that process is. Okay, in contrast, if you ingest some poison or something or some food that's rotten, that is ejected from your mouth before you're even consciously aware of it, because you don't have time to be like, oh yeah, arsenic or cyanide does taste like almonds. So our body is even set up for that. You can think of that as that quote unquote negativity bias, where it's like, hey, get this out of here because I could die, as compared to, some chocolate could be better than others, but you can take your time with this.
Yeah. Wow. Super interesting. That's fascinating, and it's so true. It's like when you touch the hot stove, it's like you retract your hand way faster than your brain is even able to register that you were touching a really hot stove.
Yeah, it doesn't even get to your brain; it just goes to the level of your spinal cord, and you get that reflex.
Damn. Doesn't it hit like your amygdala or something? Isn't there some like interesting neuroscience there?
Well, that's afterwards.
Oh, wow.
So, and also the amygdala is a complex organism. I think people tend to associate it with like, oh, there's the fear organ. And it's not really how the brain works. It's a little more complex than that. But it certainly can help us determine pretty quickly if there's danger or if there's not danger, right? But with a hot stove, for example, you're doing that reflex before you even get to the amygdala.
Whoa.
But afterwards, your brain could be like, hey, that was hot. You shouldn't do that again. Or you should check the stove to see if it's on next time before you put your hand on it.
Wow. So interesting. Okay. So when it comes to breaking the hunger habit, I mean, this is something that I personally experience all the time where I eat out of boredom primarily. I'm not like a big stress eater. I don't eat when I'm stressed, but I definitely, I'm one of those people that like when bored, I go to the fridge, I open up the fridge. Oftentimes I end up closing it because I just wanted to go to it and see, but I do feel like that is a major source of calories for people today, right? Where we're just eating foods with no real physiologic necessity. So yeah, when it comes to breaking that cycle, I mean, what's like the first step that somebody should take to break that cycle when they feel as though they are about to act on it?
Yeah. So that first step is mapping out the habit loop and being able to identify it. So if we don't see that we're in a habit loop, there's no way we can step out of it. So even we could recognize all three elements, the trigger, the behavior, and the result. Or we can simplify that and start with the behavior and the result, because the trigger is actually not as important. I would argue that the trigger is unimportant, where a lot of people think, oh, if I could just avoid my food triggers, I'd be all good.
Meaning like whether it's boredom, whether it's stress, whether it's anxiety.
Yeah. So how do you avoid boredom? You can't really. You get bored, you get bored.
Right.
So one, you can't avoid the triggers, but more important than that, if you look at the mechanism, that's not what perpetuates a habit. How rewarding the behavior is what perpetuates the habit. That's why it's called reward-based learning. So the trigger, certainly it sets the process in motion, but if we focus our energy on the trigger, we're actually wasting energy where we could be focusing on what's actually important, as in the behavior and the result relationship. And so that gets actually to the second step. But does that make sense, the first step, before we go on?
That the mechanism is generally the same regardless of what the trigger is. And so...
Yeah. And the mapping of that, being able to see what the behavior is. So for example, if we're mindlessly eating and we can pay attention, we can notice, oh, I'm not actually hungry. I'm just eating out of boredom or because that snack happens to be there. It's like the seafood, I see food and I eat it type of thing. So we've got to be able to wake up to that and see that it's happening. That's the first step.
Got it. So to be able to identify that when you are triggered, you tend to, some people might not choose to go to the cupboard or the fridge, but to know that that is your behavioral response, to bring awareness to that, that's step one.
Yep. And it's pretty straightforward, right? It's like, oh, I'm going in to the refrigerator or whatever, just noticing that, like, oh, here it is again.
Some people might choose to have a cigarette.
Right.
Yeah.
Some cigarette, scroll on social media, check email. There are a lot of things a lot of behaviors that get triggered.
Right.
But that's the general category, is just, what's the trigger that we go to when we're, when we're triggered by the emotion or the thought or whatever.
Yeah. Why couldn't they be like good, like positive habits? Well, I guess for some they are.
Yeah.
Like when I get anxious or depressed, most of the time I go to the gym. Like I remind myself that this is where exercise really, plays a valuable role.
So let's bookmark that. Let's come back to that when we get to the second and third step, because that is absolutely true. And we can explore why that's the case and how you've developed that as a healthy habit as compared to an unhealthy habit.
Let's do it. I'm excited to get back to that. Okay, so we're about to go into step 2.
Yeah. So step 2 is where it gets really interesting, right? Because you can map out a habit, not that hard to do. And often when my patients or the folks in our programs or even my students start mapping these out, they come back and they're like, how did I not notice all of these habits that I have? Because then they start to see them everywhere. And I'll just highlight, most habits that we have are either neutral or helpful, like going to the gym, helpful habit. But some of these pesky ones, they get in the way of us living that healthy life. And so the second step, I think of this as the beginning of the end, because you can't go back once you start to see this. And what I mean by this, let's use smoking as a starter here. When my patients come back and they taste and smell their cigarettes, as and they're like, oh, this is really crappy, they can't unsee that. It's like Santa Claus. You pull down on Santa Claus's beard and suddenly like you've lost your belief in Santa Claus. You can't like get that back.
Yeah.
And so this process in general, we think of this as disenchantment, where you become disenchanted with the old behavior. And again, the one way to do this is to bring awareness to what's happening. So we need awareness to map out a habit loop. We need that awareness to become disenchanted. Let's see, a food example. Okay. So let's say that there's a new bakery that opens up in my neighborhood. And I go in there and I have a certain, I know how much I like certain types of chocolate cake, let's say. And so I see the chocolate cake in their display case and I'm like, oh, that looks good. I try some. So I eat the cake. There's some awareness. And like, it's the best chocolate cake I've ever had. Mm-hmm. I get what's called a positive prediction error in my brain, meaning it's better than expected. And I get a dopamine spritz and it says, remember this, right? It's just like finding food in the forest. It's like, oh, there's a good food source. So for me, it's like, oh, there's a good chocolate cake source. So I learn good place to get cake. On the other hand, if I eat the cake, I'm like, meh, I've had better. I get what's called a negative prediction error.
Got it.
Same type of dopamine spritz, slightly different mechanism in terms of learning the positive versus the negative, but basically same parts of the brain. And I learned, hey, this isn't such great cake. Don't bother to go back to this bakery. Notice that I've learned something either way, as long as I've paid attention. Now, we can leverage this to break bad habits, but I want to highlight something first. If you look at the equations for this, the mathematical equations for this, none of them involve willpower as a variable. So that's really important because a lot of people think, oh, if I want to break a bad habit, I just have to use my willpower. That is, I think that's help. It's quote unquote helpful for companies that want you to sign up for their weight loss programs. Because they say, hey, whatever this diet is, usually it's a calorie restriction diet. As long as you restrict calories, you're going to lose weight. I learned that in medical school. That is a fact. It is true. But how you do that isn't about just like using your willpower.
Right.
It is more myth than muscle. And at best, if you look at the parts of the brain that are involved in cognitive control, the prefrontal cortex, it's the first part of the brain that goes offline when we're hungry, when we're stressed, when we're angry, when we're anxious. Can you see the problem here?
Yeah, the rational part of our brain is the part of our brain that just so happens to go offline when we are triggered.
Absolutely. So I wouldn't put my money on that if you're trying to break a bad habit.
Yeah, calories in, calories out. I mean, it works. I mean, it is the fundamental scientific, mathematical, biological truth underlying weight loss, but as a strategy, it's terrible.
Yeah. And so now, the willpower folks hopefully will catch up with the neuroscience, which says place willpower off to the side. Let's leverage the strength of the brain. And so back to those mathematical equations, no willpower in the variables, but that error term that gets change to happen, that's that positive and negative prediction error. And notice how the only thing that's required for that is awareness, which is great. It's not like you have to learn some fancy technique or some concept. You just have to pay attention.
Well, a positive prediction error would seem to me to reinforce a bad habit, whereas a negative prediction error would be what you would want to encourage somehow.
Well, this is where we can...
Right? Like if you text your ex and you get back with your ex and you have sex with your ex and the sex is better than you remembered, that's not helpful in terms of breaking that bad habit, right?
Well,
if it's worse than you remember,
then you're like,
that
okay,
could
now
take you a few months of not wanting to text your ex.
Yes. So going with that example, if you think of the far end of the spectrum of bad habit, addiction, right? Continued use despite adverse consequences. So you text your ex, right? And you're like, you have great breakup sex. And then you're like, and then everything goes to hell from there, right? Continued use despite adverse consequences. You kind of conveniently forget, like, oh, well, yeah, this is why we broke up. And then 3 weeks later, you're like, oh, this is a good idea. And so you can see how there can be continued use despite adverse consequences going on there. The adverse consequences piece, if we pay attention, that's going to help us learn, hey, maybe texting your ex isn't such a great idea. And it's not because like I shouldn't do it. It's like we feel into what it was like the last time we did it. And it's not necessarily the great breakup sex piece, but it's everything else, all the sequelae of that.
Got it.
Right?
So bring awareness to the adverse effects.
Yes. And that's where it comes in with eating as well. We did a study in my lab. We have this app called Eat Right Now where we can actually build in a tool to help people pay attention as they overeat. Okay. Again, very, very wise body. We wanted to test to see how quickly that reward value dropped below zero and people shifted their behavior with overeating. Can you guess how many times it took for somebody to have that reward value drop below 0?
Wait, so repeat the question. So you had how many times once?
It was close. Yeah. So these are people, some of them had been overeating for decades, right? So you think, oh, it might take a long time. 10 to 15 times of paying attention when you overeat, and that reward value is below 0, right?
So it's still really low after a lifetime of chronic overeating.
Yeah, which makes sense because our brains have to be very adaptable to ever-changing environments, right? So if if it took you 20 times to get chased by a tiger to learn that it's dangerous, you probably wouldn't survive.
Right. That's a great point. Okay, so really, I mean, awareness is key.
Yeah. And that's where we can double down on awareness. But let's get at this, finish out the second step first. So as we pay attention, for example, when we overeat, our body says, dude, why are you doing this? This doesn't feel very good, right? I've never had somebody come back to me and say, oh, thank you, Dr. Brewer. Now I didn't realize how great cigarettes taste or how good it feels to stuff myself at Thanksgiving. That just doesn't happen because our body's like, hey, you're ingesting toxin when it comes to smoking a cigarette. And it's like, hey, you don't need this many calories all at once.
Right.
This isn't helpful. So our bodies will tell us, and if we can just pay attention when they're trying to signal to us, like, put up the white flag, like stop eating, then we can do that pretty quickly. And if we can just remember that, that's going to help us become disenchanted with the behavior. So we start with a very simple question, which is having people ask themselves, what am I getting from this, right? As they're eating that next overstuffed bite, how does it feel in my body? Not, I shouldn't overeat, not thinking about it.
So that's a question that people should be asking themselves and get used to asking themselves, what am I getting from this?
Yes, absolutely. What am I getting from this? And I think of it this way. The feeling body is much stronger than the thinking brain. So what am I getting from this? Not in a thinking way, like, oh, I'm eating too many calories, but feeling, because their body is saying, hey, you're eating too many calories. Do you see the difference? They got to feel into it.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. I went to a Brazilian steakhouse last night. Incredible place in Los Angeles called H&H. All grass-fed meat. But I definitely overate. Overate last night and was paying quite the price afterwards. My stomach just felt distended, and I definitely regretted going overboard to the extent that I had.
Yeah.
And so this is a really helpful tip because I feel like next time I'm going to be more inclined to ask myself in the moment, right? What am I getting from this?
Yeah, and one way to think about this. I talk about this a bit in the hunger habit is we can find our pleasure plateau. So as you eat that first bite, of dinner, especially if you're hungry, your body's like, oh, thank you. This is great. You really enjoy it. You eat the next bite, And over time, especially if you don't shovel it all in really quickly, because it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to register satiety. If you don't shovel it all in, you can start to notice with each bite that the pleasure of the same food is different. It starts to wane, right? It's not as pleasurable. And so we can start to see we're hitting that pleasure plateau where our body's like, okay, that's enough. But if we don't pay attention, we're going to go over that cliff of overindulgence, which it sounds like you hit.
Yeah, I definitely hit it last night. I was not feeling good.
Yeah.
And in the moment, I probably would have, like, if I just didn't have a lot of awareness around the discomfort that I was feeling. Instead, I was more thinking about, well, I'm eating lots of protein, which is great because earlier that day I know that I had a really intense workout, and so I was like, oh, this is probably beneficial for me. More protein. But that led to me actually just overeating in general,
Yeah. So if you can remember that, I mean, think back to last night. How excited are you right now if you were back at that steakhouse to do the exact same thing?
Super excited to get into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how about that overindulgence piece, the cliff?
Oh, yeah. Definitely would not eat as much as I did last night. Yeah.
So how much willpower did that take?
To just have that realization?
Yeah.
None.
Yeah. So this is a zero willpower thing, and you just demonstrated it beautifully.
But what about there's a cognitive bias? Is it like rear view mirror bias or something? I forget the name of it, but it's like essentially like the further something gets from your memory, the more we tend to paint that experience with rose-colored hues.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like I right now remember how bad it was feeling so distended and full last night. but a week from now, I'm not going to necessarily have remembered that.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes. So that is a very true phenomenon. And so it's really important to do two things. One is
recency bias. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
It's like a form of recency bias.
Yeah. So where you tend to remember the things more vividly if they're recent. Yeah, it's a recency bias.
Yeah.
So as things get in the rearview mirror, if we've only done it a couple of times or we haven't paid attention, or we kind of conveniently forget because our brain's like, oh, just remember the good stuff, right? Then it's going to be harder to change. But if we can really dial that in and recall what it was like the last time, really feel into it, not just like, oh, that was great being at the steakhouse, but like, oh, I felt like crap afterwards.
Yeah.
Then it makes it easier to bring that recollection up the next time and then predict, okay, how's this going to be if I do the same thing? The way that I think about this is if in science, if you've got a data point that's an anomaly, but you've done the same thing over and over and over again, your brain's going to be like, well, maybe that's an anomaly. So I'm just going to ignore it because it's not what I'm used to. But if you do it over and over and over, suddenly that signal to noise ratio gets really clear. And you're like, oh, that's actually a true signal. So if it's a small difference, it takes a long time to get that signal to noise ratio to be good enough that you can trust it. But if it's a big thing, for example, if you got food poisoning at a certain restaurant, that's like, okay, wow, that was real. Suddenly you're going to avoid that restaurant after one use, right? After one meal. So the magnitude of the effect makes a difference. And we can actually, I wouldn't say artificially, but we can amplify that magnitude by paying attention. If we really pay attention every time we do whatever it is, those data are going to be more solid and our body's going to remember that more easily.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Are there any, because this is a lot of like internal work, any external tools that might play a supportive role, like journaling, for example?
Some people find journaling very helpful in our programs. We have this online community where people can keep journals. And so for some people, that's really helpful. And what that does is it helps them articulate their experience. So I'm glad you highlight that this is internal work because really the key to change here is internal work, right? It's about being curious about what our direct experience is. Journaling can be very helpful. Talking to somebody, it's like, oh, this is what I noticed. Like we talk about your Brazilian steakhouse thing. You're going to be able to recall that more easily next time because we actually talked about it, which actually brought that memory up because you have to remember it. And like, what did that really feel like to describe it to me? Yeah.
It's not often that I feel like I've overeaten steak. But last night it was my brother's birthday. So we went out, we did it pretty big. No regrets. No, I do definitely regret eating so much, but great place. Very important. So, okay, let's circle back and talk about when it comes to solidifying a healthy habit. So, like, for example, a lot of people, especially now as we get into the new year, are going to be probably really focused on adopting healthier habits, like whether it's that, the gym membership that they're signing up for or a new fitness program. How do we then encourage these healthier habits and make it more likely that we're going to stick to them ultimately?
Good question. So this is where this third step comes in, and we can actually use your gym example as an example of that. So knowing that our brain is going to become disenchanted with old habits through that negative prediction error, and by simply paying attention and seeing that eating 3 pieces of cake is not as good as eating 1, or overeating the steak just doesn't feel very good, we can then start to dial it back when it comes to eating, where we can see, like if I stopped eating here, I would still enjoy the steak, probably enjoy it more because I'm not regretting it afterwards. And so just not overindulging is already in that third step category. And I call this finding the bigger, better offer, right? And so our brain is always looking for that bigger, better offer. It's like, okay, if this isn't that great, give me something better. And that better could simply be not overindulging. It could be, for me, I started to pay attention when I was eating gummy worms. I used to be addicted to those. I read about that in the book.
I remember that, actually. You told me that the first time we chatted.
Oh, yeah. So it's like, if I pay attention to overeating, or eating, actually now it's eating any gummy worms, my body's just like, ugh, this is not worth it. And then I go to natural sources of sweetness, like blueberries, just no brainer. Like my brain it highly prefers blueberries. So whether it's not overindulging, whether it's finding healthier alternatives, again, our body is very wise. It's going to tell us You know, blueberries probably co-evolved with us to be this perfect mix of sweetness and pop and sugar, you know, like that fiber and sugar ratio and all that. They're amazing and they're good for your brain, right? So on top of that,
yeah.
So that's when it comes to eating, we can just pay attention, you know, how much, what am I eating? When am I eating? Am I actually hungry or not hungry? And that bigger, better offer comes in all those flavors where it's like finding healthier foods not because we should eat them, but because our body's like, dude, that was good. Do that again. The amounts, right? Stopping when we're full. And then also eating when we're hungry and not eating when we're not hungry. We can apply the same thing to say going to the gym because, well, if I could interrogate you a little bit.
Yeah.
Why do you think you formed the habit of going to the gym?
Well, similar to the blueberry concept, I just generally feel like my brain really benefits from it. My mental health benefits from it. I could be feeling lethargic, a sense of mental cobwebs, anxious, depressed. But, you know, I feel like I'm a different person leaving the gym than I am typically walking into it. It just, yeah, it's a state change for me. And then, so there's that, those are the cognitive and mental benefits, but then also from a physical standpoint, I love the confidence that it gives me. I love what it does to my physique, you know, consistent, regular resistance training. And so, yeah, there are a number of different reinforcement like aspects of it that are reinforcing.
Yeah. So you just described a beautiful example of finding those bigger, better offers. So if you compare being sluggish, feeling out of shape, you know, mentally dull to what you just described, it's a no-brainer, right? So for you, well, I don't want to presume your experience, but when you're feeling lethargic, what motivates you to go to the gym?
Yeah, that is a good question because when you're intuitively, you might think that the gym would be the last place that you'd want to go to when you're feeling lethargic. But ironically, even though you're expending energy in the gym, it's one of the few areas where you spend, and in so doing, you actually gain more.
Yeah.
Right? It's a really odd thing.
It is. And so when you just recall the last time you go to the gym, how does that feel?
When I recall the last time I went to the gym, the last time I went to the gym was yesterday. And I had an epic back workout, had an awesome pump as a result, and I destroyed my lats and my biceps. And I feel really good today.
I was going to say, you're smiling. I can even see it in your eyes, right? So just recalling that, you can just and I say this for anybody that is struggling to motivate themselves to find healthy habits, just recalling the last time we did the healthy habit can be enough of a kick in the pants in a good way. It's not even a kick in the pants. It's kind of like a tug. It's like, oh, come on, this is fun. This is good. You know, that's that positive prediction error that says, hey, this is better. Keep doing it. And that's how we form healthy habits. It's not through willpower. It's not by telling ourselves, oh, it's January 1st. I should, you know, sign up for the gym that I'm, again, not going to go to because I haven't set up, I haven't figured out how my brain works.
Yeah.
But it's really about just dialing it in and asking, well, what was it like? What's it like to feel like I'm in shape? Feels pretty good.
Feels pretty good. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's because, and I've obviously brought awareness to that because it's something that I genuinely love. But take something really, you know, seemingly mundane, like just drinking a glass of water every morning. Like to bring awareness to something that I typically don't bring very much awareness to. I just maybe out of habit I do it. But you know, it feels really good to hydrate your body after 8 hours of not having a drink, right? Yeah. Sleep is a dehydrative event. So drinking that water in the morning, well, it's really refreshing. And I feel like I'm giving my body, you know, the hydration that it needs after such a long time. And it's like a really primordial, ancient thing. We've co-evolved. All organisms require water, right? And so you're giving your body something that it evolved to require and appreciate. And I'm very grateful that I now get delivered to my house. Before I was reverse osmosis purifying my water, but now I get spring water from like a super pristine source delivered in glass straight to my house every week. And I get to drink that. I'm so grateful that I get to drink that. Yeah. So it's like, I don't normally think about that.
Yeah.
But
so notice how you are describing paying attention to what it's like when you rehydrate in the morning. That's very different than telling ourselves or watching some YouTube video like, oh, you should drink 32 ounces or whatever, like, and the number's always changing.
Yeah.
The bottom line is drink water. It's good for you, right? Not too much, not too little, right? That's about, I'm thinking of Michael Pollan's food rules that basically boil down to like, don't eat too much.
Right.
If you can't pronounce it, don't eat it type of thing. Yeah. So here with water, if you pay attention, and I'm smiling because this is the same thing that I do. It's like I feel thirsty in the morning. That's unpleasant. I drink some water and it's pleasant because my body's like, oh, thank you, And that's all you need is really that awareness, because that awareness will set the habit to do it again in the future.
Yeah. It is a very interesting exercise to think about where everybody obviously has like positive things that they do every day, right? Mm-hmm. That you can bring increased awareness to. And then conversely, the thing that you want to integrate as a new healthy habit and to really kind of cultivate awareness around that as well.
Yeah, totally.
However mundane it may seem.
Yeah. And the beauty of this is that it takes one thing, awareness, right? First step, map out the habit loop, awareness. Second step, ask, what am I getting from this? Awareness. Third step, notice how good it feels to step out of the old habit and into a new habit. Awareness.
There are many factors that are, I think, that are not super helpful when it comes to cultivating greater awareness, right? Like our devices. We used to allow our minds to wander, right? And introspect. And now whenever we're not being stimulated, right? We're almost like we go into withdrawal from our devices and from that stimulation.
Yeah.
And so that's a big problem, I think, like the always on nature of our devices and social media and the like.
Yes. And the good news is if that's a habit, we can break it in the same way. Not to, there's all this hype around, oh, I should just delete this or go on a dopamine fast or, stop doing this. All of that is divorced from our bodies.
Yeah.
And when we do that, I say, okay, how well did that work for you? People are like, that was terrible.
Yeah.
And then I went right back to it. We call this the abstinence violation effect in addiction treatment, where it's like you've forced yourself not to use substance, which could include, let's say social media. And then our body's just like, I can't wait. And then as soon as we slip up, it's like off to the races, we're like, okay, back to the old habit and then some, because our body's like, oh, I want more of this. I want more. Because, we crave what we can't have.
Is there any data on how many times someone must do something before it becomes hardwired as a habit?
It's a really good question. Here, there's a lot of mythology on the internet about that.
Right.
What's the one that you've heard the most? I'm just curious. How long it takes to form a new habit or break a bad habit?
Form a new habit. Yeah. A specific number doesn't come to mind, but there was like an oddly specific number, I feel like, associated with the last time I looked into the lore surrounding that concept.
Yeah. I think the greatest lore out there, and this is all these algorithmically derived things where it's like, oh, if something's at the top, it's going to stay at the top because it's at the top, not because it's true.
Yeah.
So the one that I've seen the most is 21 days. Right?
21 was on the tip of my tongue, but I don't want to. Interesting.
That's it. So that is based on a plastic surgeon who wrote a book in the 1960s who just offhandedly talked about how long it took his patients to get used to their new nose jobs.
Interesting.
So not exactly scientific.
So odd, yeah, that would then be connected to like habit formation.
Yeah, well, 3 weeks is just a nice number. And then you say it a couple of times on the internet, and then people reference it, and then suddenly it blows up, and that becomes the truth, the ground truth.
It's like Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 Hours of Mastery, right? It's like there's no science there.
Yeah, there's no, but it's a good book.
Yeah, it's a great book. I love Malcolm Gladwell. No shade. But do you think heuristics like that are helpful or hurtful?
I don't think, well, anything that's not accurate that might actually send somebody in the wrong direction is not going to be helpful.
Right.
So think of it as somebody's like, well, 21 days, why didn't it work? Is there something wrong with me? And they start blaming themselves. It's kind of like the calories in, calories out thing.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't stick to it. I need more willpower. There's something wrong with me. So it's detrimental in that respect. And then people aren't seeking the truth, and they're just blaming themselves and thinking they should work harder. So I'm also a scientist. Like, I want to know the truth. I want to help the truth get out there, and I want the truth to help people change their lives. And so if we know, hey, the truth is, and this was in our study where it took 10 to 15 times. So the more you pay attention, let me back up and say there are a huge number of variables that affect this. So somebody's genes, somebody's environment, somebody's upbringing, socioeconomic status, all this stuff affects whether somebody's going to be able to break a bad habit, form a new habit, right? Availability, all these things. So it's very variable depending on the person. And if you look at it, what the most constant thing is, the more we pay attention to how rewarding a helpful habit is and to how unrewarding an unhelpful habit is, the faster we're going to make that change.
Interesting. So the greater the degree of awareness that we're able to bring to it, the more, I guess, the faster we'll be able to cement that habit as a habit.
Yeah, it's like that signal to noise ratio thing. You're getting that clear difference where your brain's saying, okay, this is unambiguous. I know this feels good. It's like you talking about drinking water, going to the gym. You smile when you talk about it, right? Because you can get that feeling so easily because you've logged that so many times.
Yeah,
it's like,
I can literally transport myself back to like the just after the workout yesterday when I was like, man, I really hit like every major muscle group of my posterior chain, upper body, and I just felt really good. And then how good I felt afterwards, eating like a really high protein lunch, and to cement those, to lock those gains in, even though we know that there's really no such thing as an anabolic window, or at least it's a lot less important than it had been considered in the past. But nonetheless, I really like that whole like thing. I love the whole routine of waking up in the morning, drinking water, having a coffee, eating some combination of protein and carbs, getting an amazing workout in, and then afterwards hitting like lunch for a really healthy, high protein, fiber rich lunch.
Yeah, I totally get it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like the best way I feel like I'm on top of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So great. I'm a man of simple needs,
Well, I think we all are, and we make life more complex than it needs to be.
Totally. I mean, God, your lips to God's ears. It's so true. Why do we do that?
Yeah.
What's the neuroscience underpinning that?
Well, I'll give you some more baseless speculation, some BS. So here, I think when something, if something works and we don't know how it works, we start to fall into this correlation equals causation fallacy, where our brain's like, oh, I did that. That must have caused it. And then we do it again and it doesn't work. And our brain goes into a tailspin and says, well, that's supposed to work. Why didn't it work? And it says, well, maybe I'll add this on, or maybe I'll do something slightly differently. And so we're constantly chasing our tail, running around in life, trying to do things that are going to stick, that are going to be consistent. Our brain loves consistency. And so we make life complex because we haven't figured out how simple life actually is. So I think one way to put that is, if we don't know how brains work, we can't work with our brains. Once we know how our brains work, we can not only work with our brains, but we can put our brains to work for us. And then we start to see that everything becomes simpler and simpler and simpler, because we're not doing 8 things to make us happy or make us feel content and fulfilled. We're seeing very clearly what's doing it, and we're repeating that over and over. And then it's like, oh yeah, of course I'm going to do this, right? You don't have to go and try to figure out how to find happiness. It's actually chasing us, and we're just not paying attention.
Happiness is chasing us.
Yeah.
So true. It's an act, You like literally have to be open to receiving happiness.
You do. I like how you put that, for sure.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit about nicotine, because you work with, you've done all these interesting studies with regard to smoking, and this is something that I've been dabbling with. Low dose nicotine.
Okay.
And I subjectively feel like I have a pretty noticeable cognitive benefit from it. I haven't taken any today, and I try not to do it every day, which is fairly easy to me. I don't have an addictive personality or anything like that. But I do notice that when I take low dose, like a 3 milligram knick-knack tab, which is one of these I have no affiliation, but they send me them, and I find them to be really helpful. Most noticeably with regard to verbal fluency for me, which is something that I already feel like I have I'm a professional communicator. I've gone on, my whole career at this point. I've been on TV and whatever. But when I take a little bit, like a low dose of it, I feel like it just has a really powerful nootropic effect.
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes sense. I mean, the physiology of nicotine, there are nicotinic receptors, there are subunits of these receptors that are all worked out, this acetylcholine system, that affects the dopamine system. So that physiology has been worked out, and it's nicotine is a stimulant. So too much of a stimulant, you get the jitters, things can go south. But maybe a little bit, as you're highlighting, you're probably tickling those pathways and you're probably dialing it in yourself for how much is helpful for you.
Yeah.
And so you're going to get those benefits because it's going literally right to your brain.
Yeah.
And it's doing what it's there are these nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in your brain that are getting fired, and then it's affecting the downstream physiology. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And speaking of bad habits, it is highly addictive. So I'm not recommending that y'all go out and follow suit, but it's, at least from I've done a very cursory look into the literature on nicotine, and it's hard to parse the health effects that are derived from nicotine from the obviously very negative health effects of smoking.
Right.
Are you aware of any data on that? Like, is it killing me, or is it, because there is also some thinking that nicotine by itself, in and of itself, is a potentially neuroprotective compound.
Yes, and I'm not an expert here, but you're highlighting a couple of important things. One is with cigarettes, it's really hard to separate out the nicotine from the 5,000 other chemicals in a cigarette, and most of those are not good for you, right? So that's been clear for decades.
Yeah.
So when people can now isolate and deliver nicotine in a very clean way, they can start to study this more carefully and get better data. I haven't seen any definitive studies, and I one way or the other, but I certainly haven't seen anything that's like, any amount of nicotine is bad. Like if you look at the alcohol studies, it's really interesting. Now more and more we're seeing consistent studies suggesting like no level of alcohol is good for us.
Right.
From a physiologic standpoint, I mean, sociologically and things like that, it's more nuanced than that. For some people for their mental health, and again, as an addiction psychiatrist, I'm not recommending it, but just as an example, alcohol is pretty definitive, at least right now. Science always changes. That's the nature of science. But I don't think that's going to get reversed just with the sheer volume of studies out there. I don't think there are enough studies on nicotine. And it's a little harder to do those studies because so many people drink alcohol. You can actually do large scale studies, whereas fewer and fewer people are smoking, and very, very few people are actually taking something as clean as like a nicotine tablet, because vaping also it's unclear what the health risks of vaping are, just because even though it's been around a while, it's still new enough that we don't know, like, hey, what are going to be the long-term effects on somebody's lungs when they're taking this superheated, steam type thing with this changed nicotine compound, because they have to change it a bit to get it to aerosolize and all that. What are the long-term effects of that going into your lungs? I don't want to be one of the people 20 years down the road and being like, I shouldn't have been vaping.
Yeah.
Certainly probably better than smoking cigarettes. But ultimately, I love to see my patients like off of cigarettes and then off of the vaping, if they're using vaping as a transition.
Yeah. No, it makes total sense. I can't wait. I hope those studies, ultimately come out. Nicotine is also not it's not a compound that it can be patented as far as I know. So it's, there's not a ton of money probably in just studying that one isolated compound.
Yeah, but, it's a good point. You follow the money and people are like, I can't make money off it. I'm not going to follow it.
Yeah. I mean, and I do know that even isolated nicotine, like it can increase your blood pressure. It's not something that you want to mess with if you have, pre-existing like hypertension or anything like that.
It is a stimulant. Yeah.
It's a stimulant. Yeah. But I think at this point, like I've cultivated a pretty healthy relationship with it. I definitely don't do it every day, but I have noticed some benefits from it. So, very, very interesting stuff. So who did you write The Hunger Habit for? I mean, it's such an important book, and it's a bit of a departure from your previous books, right? Which are purely focused on mental health. This is like more about, getting our like nutrition under control, which is, I think, such an important topic, such an important issue.
Yes. Well, one, I think we often divorce our mind and our body. And so we're like, oh, mental health, oh, physical health. It's really just one human, and the mental affects the physical affects the mental. So even if you just look at it this way, this food mood relationship where if you eat crap, you feel like crap, or if you feel like crap and then you're drawn to eat crap because you're in the habit of doing that. So it's really hard to separate out the mental and behavioral health aspects of things. So that being said, with eating, to me, eating is both a physical and a mental thing.
Yeah.
Where in terms of affecting our physical health and affecting our mental health. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I kind of stumbled into this field when, as an addiction psychiatrist, was focusing on first alcohol, cocaine use disorder, then nicotine with cigarettes. And then, people were saying, hey, could you help me change my eating habits? And so stumbled into this and realized, hey, we have this clinical obesity epidemic, and all the things I'd learned in medical school aren't helping people because it's getting worse. Could we apply this to eating? And so I wrote it basically for anybody that has an unhealthy relationship with eating, and that's why I call it the hunger habit, because it's like we could be habitually overeating. We could be stuffing down our emotions with eating. We could be eating mindlessly. There are all these different ways that it just becomes habitual. So I wrote that basically for anybody that is not, that's not aware when they're eating.
Yeah. It's very crucial to put the spotlight on mindset. And because that is really the most important. My good friends at Mind Pump, which is a huge fitness podcast, and we collab a lot. We're super close friends. That's something that they always bring up, is the fact that you can't change somebody's behavior in a way that is enduring without tackling the mindset first.
Absolutely. 100% agree.
Yeah, it's super important. Well, I love it, man. Thanks for coming in, and thanks for sharing your brilliant insights and knowledge and wisdom with us. Where can people connect with you on social media, and where can they pick up the book?
So my website's probably an easy place, drjud.com, drjud.com. I'm on Instagram, dr.jud. I'm on formerly known as Twitter, now X, Jud Brewer. But Instagram is probably the easiest place, and my website, drjud.com. And they can pick up the book. Want to support independent bookstores. So on my website, there are a bunch of independent bookstores listed, but of course they can get it at the behemoths like Amazon and others.
Love it. Love it.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.